After 9 long years, the guns finally laid silent. The ink was on paper, and the negotiations ended. The 7 Years' War was over. Britain was to remain on the sidelines of European politics. Its navy, while strong, was unable to compensate for its defeats on the continent. France had stumbled, but in the end was victorious. The Prussians had been defeated, surrounded by 3 armies at once. The Austrians were mutually happy that this up-and-coming rival was no longer a threat. Peace had come to Europe. And even though no one knew it, this French victory would have dramatic consequences for the Western world, and how it prevented the dramatic from occurring. France had just dodged a century of political turmoil, a revolution, a dictator, and an empire on its doorstep. All events that occurred in a different timeline. Our timeline. In this alternate scenario, the French have something that prevents them from going down this path. War spoils and time. This is a world where the French won the 7 Years' War. You must be thinking, wait a second, didn't he just do a video about if France won the French and Indian War? How's this not different? Keen eye, avid viewer. This video is a continuation of a previous scenario, one that focused exclusively on the American front in the French and Indian War. If you didn't watch that first video, don't worry. Here's a brief recap. France's victory in North America doesn't save it from the inevitable tide of Anglo-colonists. Poor Quebec was going to be overrun in due time. Yet even though New France one day does fall to the swarm, even a little delay goes a long way. France retained its colonies, not only keeping the colonists on edge, but preventing one of the reasons for the revolution in the first place: Parliament stopping the Americans from going out west. With the French remaining, British North America overcomes its period of rebellion and becomes more loyal, or at least tolerant, to the crown. For the time being, they're not in a situation to rebel. I did say that there was a chance the French Revolution would still occur, as the poverty was too great and the system was too corrupt. Yet upon thinking back, I realize I was partly wrong. Yes, I know, partly. Revolution was not inevitable in France, but reform was. The French winning the 7 Years' War does one major thing. It buys the French monarchy more time to get out of its debt. Not needing to aid the Americans does wonders for them as well. These are factors the alternate French never knew they narrowly dodged. Post 7 Years' War France still has problems. Sure, the feudal system of government, the corrupt nobility, the immense debt, these are still problems that will need to be confronted one day. But not now, and certainly not in the way that they did it in our timeline. A victory in the 7 Years' War spares France from descending into a sudden and violent upheaval, but the cracks still remain. When imagining how France might reshape an alternate Europe, it should be kept in mind we're talking about the Bourbons. While it's possible that the French monarchy could have reformed with this victory, it's still a possibility that we'd only see a string of alternate bad decisions that build towards a very similar situation of the 1790s. I could list all of the decisions the monarchy would need to do to avoid revolution, yet that isn't what you came for. And the French Revolution was so unique in how many wrong turns were taken, just this victory already means revolt and reform doesn't happen at all like it did in our timeline. Most importantly here, Napoleon, his conquests, and all that his reign entailed in shaping 19th century Europe, not in its military consequences, but in the ideological cat that it let out of the bag, the idea of popular enfranchisement and democratic ideals. Yet before I talk about that, let's discuss some immediate effects of the war. You know, the map changes, the stuff you guys like. Once the treaties are ratified, it'd be clear on who one of the main losers would be: Prussia. While it had seemed like the small militaristic nation was on the rise, it wasn't to be. Perhaps the war against Austria was just a fluke, as the 7 Years' War results in the armies from 3 different kingdoms knocking down the door into Berlin. During the negotiations, I could easily see Britain worrying more about Hanover or their overseas colonies, and allowing France and Austria to just carve up chunks of Prussia. A weakened Berlin was best for all. The war permanently stunts their growth. Frederick may or may not have committed suicide following such a crushing defeat, leaving the future of even the Prussian monarchy up in the air. Not only are they now in the gutter, but their main roadmap to becoming an empire just doesn't exist anymore. In this alternate timeline, no French Revolution brings no Napoleon and no conquest of the Holy Roman Empire. The region isn't dismantled and reorganized into larger princedoms. It was this outdated and complicated system of duchies, princedoms, kingdoms, and free states that made any unifying of the German people impossible. Not to mention that Habsburgs claiming the HRE crown meant it couldn't simply be dismantled until the Habsburgs had no choice while facing Napoleon. By the 19th century, Prussia still has to deal with that outdated institution. It wasn't simply being swept aside by overwhelming military force anytime soon. Austria and the Habsburgs capitalized on this victory. There's often a debate on what a Germany united under Austria would look like. Would it just be the German Empire, but bigger? No. It wouldn't look like anything, because the last thing Austria wanted was for the German states to be unified. And as broken as the Holy Roman Empire was, it still technically was a bunch of regions fielding loyalty to the Habsburgs. Perhaps a confederation may be in its place in the future, but not for now, and unification is certainly off the table. Now, as for the other nations of Europe, no country was more affected unofficially by the war than Poland. Poland in our timeline did not live to see the 19th century, but the reason Poland was universally conquered by its neighbors at the same time wasn't just because it was a landlocked country split between three militarily strong rivals. It was because Poland by the 1790s was fully buying into the ideas of the French Revolution. And so the experiment was put down before it could begin. In this alternate timeline, Poland is an independent state and continues on. Not simply because there is no revolution, but because the Bourbons had an interest in Poland. Proposed alliances, shared monarchies, a very close relationship considering they had a full Germany between them. And the Bourbons post-war would aim to assure a puppet monarchy, or at least a Bourbon monarchy, comes to power in Poland. You can debate if a puppet monarch is a really great deal for Poland, but compared to the alternatives, I'd say it's a plus. What matters is what the Bourbons do with this influence, and whether or not they can keep their absolute rule of monarchy and system of nobility from crumbling down. Would the next century of industry chip away at the old regime, or does technological progress just become a new tool for the ruling class? That becomes a question for the next century. I know some of you are going to get quite mad at me for saying this, but France still would never match the British Navy. Sorry, France. While it's fun to ponder if the French beat back the British and invaded the island like they planned to do, I want to keep this somewhat grounded. No occupation of Britain, no French Navy dominating the seas. Instead, Britain remains a colonial power, and France uses its victory to focus on Europe itself, dealing with those pesky Habsburgs, various German states, and Russia. While the Bourbons from the 1760s onward play house and remake Europe, competing against monarchs and making temporary allies, I'm more interested in what will happen for the common folk of France. You know, the peasants, the urban poor, the ones technically not citizens, but just people working the land for rich families. Even had the French won the 7 Years' War, the luxurious spending and horrendous tax structure eventually would have to be dealt with. The French Revolution was not inevitable, yet reform was. It's pretty easy to imagine what would happen if no reform happened at all. We know the crown was attempting to reform, they just didn't have the time nor capital to be able to do so. In this alternate timeline, financial rumors are spoken in hushed tones. These remain for many decades more just that, rumors. France is able to gain a decent profit from the war, and in a way, buy itself more time to deal with these issues later. When the debt of the crown is eventually brought up, say sometime in the 19th century, there are many ways that the crisis could go. Now, we might still see the Estates General called up, the Third Estate leaving, and then... Or, more likely considering France's victory, there is a more moderate approach. Reform does occur, but the call to action does not come from the Third Estate, but the nobles themselves. Enlightenment teachings were not synonymous with democracy. Many philosophers didn't call for the masses to vote. No, the Enlightenment before the Revolution was the idea that the aristocrats and nobles themselves could be learned and intelligent. The Enlightenment was for the nobles. At the most extreme, a constitutional monarchy was proposed if need be. And I could imagine that the Bourbons at some point in the next 50 years following the war could gradually agree to a constitutional rule. This is, say, after a lesser revolt or reformation occurs. Something to spook them. Enlightenment thinking remains in theory. The praxis part isn't on the streets of Paris. Reform is slow, yet it's enough for the crown to survive. Many of these gradual reforms are not from goodwill, but purely defensive. For example, what Prussia, Russia, and other German states decided to do. Modernization was done not out of this idea of liberty or taking power away from the noble class, but from the benefits that a modern organized state can accomplish on the battlefield. Doesn't technology and the inclusion of factories upheave the aristocratic order anyway? No. Had the French aristocracy remained in power, it's unlikely that the revolution ever would have occurred. The Industrial Revolution, that is. You're saying that the Industrial Revolution just wouldn't have happened? What would have happened? The nobles just intentionally blocked progress? Yeah, there were two types of landed aristocracy. The ones we most think of are the rural aristocrats, the ones that owned a lot of land and had peasants work that land. But there was another aristocracy, the urban guilds, the craftsmen who created limited clubs by which only certain ideas came in and certain products came out. Guilds could just keep certain technology, practices, or even factories from entering their region. And this isn't just me saying this. In a paper for the American Economic Review, there are direct comparisons between regions in Germany after the Napoleonic Wars that adopted modern rational economics and those that stuck to the old ways of noble guilds. Industrialization only happened in areas that weren't controlled by guilds. The guilds and their aging laws would intentionally keep modern industry from coming in. And in fact, many nobles directly stifled industrialization. This alternate Europe of the 19th century is nothing like our own. It doesn't see a universal rise in industrialization and colonization. Instead, we see a split between the Anglo world and the French, not only in lines of thinking, but even down to ideological views and technological progress. Following the war, the British followed down a similar path that we saw in our own timeline. Their navy allows them to go forth and colonize or bully other lands, and their colonization and exploitation of other lands only fuels their small industry. In the decades following the 7 Years' War, France has control over much of continental Europe, a medieval-style feudal system of nobles that intentionally block technological progress for the sake of guilds and status. This only leads to greater disorganization, economic upheaval, and stagnation. And this only increasingly becomes more evident when another war happens, and France cannot compete. The French Revolution made the people themselves the nation. It brought that idea into the popular language, spurring not only legal systems, but ideas for revolutions of the future. What does it truly mean to be a citizen? In this alternate timeline, France in many ways becomes what Spain or Italy became in our timeline. Sorry, Spain or Italy, any reform isn't enough, and I can easily imagine that at some point there's a crossroads moment. A moment that's such an embarrassment, it forces the French nobility to self-reflect on what must be done, or else it will fall to its neighbors. Russia had this moment with Japan, Austria had it with Prussia, Spain has had it ever since the 1700s. Great empires can always fall to stagnation, and I imagine France sees the same. This most likely happens around the 1850s or 60s. For decades, Britain, Prussia, and Scandinavia would have been improving their own industry and military, while the aristocratic world would be shunning it. This all culminates in the French fighting a war they cannot win. The French Revolution created the idea of freedom for citizens across Europe, yet it also laid the foundations for the very nation-states that would exploit people around the world in the coming century. Modernization and industrialization fuel the militaries and technology that go on to conquer Asia and Africa. The Napoleonic Wars were so brutal and widespread, it forced Europe into a peace that lasted until World War I. The death of the HRE and birth of the Confederation of the Rhine laid the groundwork for Prussia to slowly unite the German states, creating an empire that used its position to peacefully bring the European states together to divide Africa amongst themselves. This is an alternate Europe not only where Germany doesn't exist, but Britain and France are still major rivals, so much so that there isn't a division of Africa peacefully. Instead, any conquest of Africa is through violent European wars not only against natives, but each other. Think about how the British took land from the Dutch Boers, but everywhere. There's a constant battle between Europeans for Africa, weakening their grips on the region. Essentially, the same aristocrats that kept European peasantry down would keep the European empires from successfully exploiting the world through sheer incompetence, at least to the extent that they did in our timeline. There is no World War I, as by the 20th century the world is much more like the 18th. The rivalries of the 20th century perhaps are not between capitalism and communism, but between nationalism and autocracy. Just not in the way that we think of those words in our timeline. How we view the modern world is due to the French Revolution, and it'd be fascinating to see a world where that just doesn't exist, where the nation isn't really a thing for most of Europe or the world, yet allegiances to families are. How does that system come crumbling down if there isn't a violent revolution? Would it be through decades of reform, or another alternate cataclysm? I'll leave that for you to decide. As for now, this is Cody of Alternate History Hub. Well, that changed a lot. The 7 Years' War dramatically shifted the lives of anyone living at the time, where people could settle who controlled what, and as a byproduct of that, future generations going forward. Especially in this case, Ohio, which France and Britain both just really wanted, I guess. And funnily enough, my family is very tied to Ohio, even more than I really had ever thought. And thanks to today's sponsor, Ancestry, I know where parts of my family would have been during this whole conflict of shenanigans, and how the 7 Years' War actually would have determined my fate. Thanks to Ancestry's vast historical records, hints, and aids from researchers, I discovered my 3 times great-grandfather, Jesse Rakestraw, who lived in Ohio, but his family had come from New Jersey, and even lived in Philadelphia before moving out west. As Quakers, it's likely nobody on that side of the family fought at all, as Quakers are pacifists. However, they were in America during the French and Indian War, and it's interesting to see how they would have viewed the conflict between the two empires. While on my mother's side, evidence uncovered dates back to my 4th great-grandfather, who owned land in the same area where my family has always lived. In the span of a century and a half, I guess nobody really moved. And also, one of the kids had the middle name Ohio, which means had the war ended in a French victory, even delaying movement into Ohio by a few decades, I just never would have existed, and that's fair to say for a lot of Ohio residents. If you want to see where your family was, you can get started by going to ancestry.com/althistory and start a free trial to explore your family history today. Using Ancestry, you'll gain a greater sense of how you came to be, and how history is not just simply events on a page, but deeply connected to how any of us came to be here. The politics during our ancestors' lives are just our history today. So, if you want to do this, go to ancestry.com/althistory and start a free trial to start exploring your family history today.